Okay, so let's get started on our readings for today. There are two today, the two essays, and maybe we can do one before and one after the break. We can actually have a discussion on each of them, maybe, before proceeding to the next, because they are quite independent of each other, although there are obviously many similarities also. I mean, there is also references. So, for the first one is A.K. Ramanujan, who was for most of his working life, he was professor in Chicago South Asian Studies, and he was a very accomplished poet who wrote in Kannada and English, and translated some of the classics of ancient Tamil literature and some Kannada poetry, literary criticism, folklore research, where he had a massive program of collecting folk tales from the South Indian states and commenting on and anthologizing them. And a linguist who has contributed to linguistics in terms of Kannada, and also, as we'll see here, he is well versed in linguistic theory. This essay is one of those, and the one that we have coming up next, which is Dipesh Chakravarti. There are two essays, and as I have indicated here, we are reading one of the Dipesh Chakravarti's essays today and the other one next week, because the one that is assigned for today is actually has some references to Ramanujan's essay also. He actually cites from it, and also has an epigraph which is a poem by Ramanujan. The other essay is a comment on Ashish Nandi, so it will be read with Ashish Nandi. Next week we will have Ashish Nandi and Dipesh Chakravarti's critical tribute to Ashish Nandi. So that's the thing. And today we will look at these two. So in a way, these are essays which are working within this field of ideas, arguments, which is very widely prevalent in India, which is to capture the distinctive qualities of Indian thought. What is Indian thought? Does it have some kind of inherent nature? Does it have its own specific qualities? Is it different from the Western ways of thinking? And as we know from previous readings, it has always been a preoccupation of intellectuals, right? So, for instance, the great big issue which came up in the 19th century, and which many of the writers we read, Rabindranath Tagore or Aurobindo, Gandhi, all of them, and even those who were referred to by those writings, such as Bankim Chandra, Ram Mohan Roy, there's one very common theme in all of these writings, which is they think that the West is very strong in material issues, that is matter, economy, economics, public life, profit and loss, business, and running governments and these sorts of things. So, whereas they want to say that Indians have a special vocation, Indians are particularly good at spiritual matters. So they somehow tried to make this into a basis of difference, which is something to think about, in the sense that can any society be exclusively materialist or spiritualist, right? Is that a possibility? But it was an argument which was arising in the context of colonialism, where you must understand that in colonialism there's always Indians are working from a very defensive position, right? Because the colonial authorities are constantly denigrating everything about India. They're saying they are superstitious, they are backward, they have no literature to speak of, they are impoverished, there's nothing, their practices there are, ancient, they have no sense of equality, and so on. Constant barrage of accusations, charges, which are meant to, part of the reason why they're doing it is they want to justify their own presence. They want to say we are here because of these deficiencies in the Western, in the Indian society. So our historic duty, our historic mandate is to work to transform them, to bring them up to date, to make them modern. So in that context, the Indians are feeling more and more defensive. They're feeling as if they are being attacked from every side. So what they do is they adopt a dichotomy, a binary, which is actually produced by the British themselves. That is, the British people will say, these people are incurably religious. They are all the time, so preoccupied with religion. They are all the time going to pilgrimages and worshipping and indulging in rituals, that there is no hope for these people. They will not improve their lives. They would rather die than earn an extra rupee and live a better life. Because for them moksha is more important, nirvana is more important than a good life here on this world. So this is actually partly a British construction, this dichotomy, this binary sort of West and East. But what happens in the late 19th century onwards is that the Indians begin to internalize the same distinction. They say, yes, we are spiritual. The West is very poor in matters of the spirit. The West is so preoccupied with making profits, right, and looking for material pleasures and benefits, that they have not paid attention to the matters of the soul, the internal spiritual development, the attainment of moksha and higher states of existence and so on. And so therefore they will say, this is ours. There are two things that they will say. One is, in terms of the actual political situation in India, they will say, you can rule this country because that's what you are good at. You can look, you are in charge of the economy, you will have the military, etc. But don't interfere in the domestic life of the society, because that is where the spiritual essence of India lies, and we want nobody to interfere in it. Right? So you sort of draw a line and say, all these matters you can look after, all these leave it to us. So it's one way of a negotiated settlement with the British, saying you can do economic reform, you can do political reform, but you can't interfere in social questions, because that is where the Indian spirit is. It cannot be. That's up to us. If you want, we will do it. You don't interfere. Now, the second way that they used the same dichotomy, the same sort of binary, is a little later in the 20th century. What they start to do is, they say, there are different races in the world, there are different civilizations in the world, and each one contributes something to the world. Right? That is, India will contribute its spiritual wealth. We may be impoverished in terms of material goods, but we have rich spiritual wealth. India is the cradle of religions, Buddhism, Jainism, some other things. And of course, Tagore will further go to say, Asia is the cradle of all religions. So if you say, look at religion as such, Christianity, Islam, Jewish religion, Hinduism, Buddhism, everything comes from Asia. So Asia has this kind of, its destiny is to provide to mankind this spiritual, dimension, to enrich the spiritual aspect. Europe's destiny is to improve your material conditions, to think scientifically, to science and technology, and more and more production of goods, for prosperity, etc. This is there. So it's like it's a kind of assigning different duties to different civilizations or different races. Like Du Bois, the American black intellectual Du Bois, who is at the same time, Du Bois is also writing, and he also tries to imagine conceive what is the African race, what will the African race contribute to the world. So that whole time is a time when people are thinking in terms of race and duty, race and contribution, race, So they are thinking about a world in which each race contributes something. This kind of a paradigm is at work there, right? So there are these two ways in which this material versus spiritual, Indian versus Western, etc., East, West, whatever, is functioning. One is to secure the private domain as off limits to European intervention. The second is to conceive Indian contribution to the world, the pool of world knowledge and wealth and so on, to say that spirituality is what we are best at. So Tagore goes all over the place, gives lectures in America, in Europe, in Japan, in China, everywhere, and that's the burden of his thing. He says, we are spiritual people. We have this great thing. Let us do, let us give to the world a new way of being, and so on. So that is the background against which we, these are, if you like, ways in which that paradigm continues to operate in an academic domain. What we have so far talked about is in the political domain, in the social domain, in public life. Intellectuals who are not academics, but who are who are very much active in social reform, in politics, etc. They are the ones, and writers, great writers, creative writers. Now we are looking at the same paradigm in operation in an academic domain, right? Of course, it's different because the academic language, in a way, changes the way that it's proposed and it's discussed. But it has certain qualities which are continuous with that grand story of, Indian distinction, Indian exceptionalism, or whatever you might call it, right? So Ramanujan, and it's also interesting to at this point talk about Chicago as a place, University of Chicago. The University of Chicago has played a very big role in the intellectual, academic, knowledge production, right? In fact, both these writers whom we are talking about today, Ramanujan and Dipesh Chakravarti, they are Chicago professors. The University of Chicago has probably the best South Asian studies library in anywhere in the world. If you want any book, that's where you'll get it. Nowhere in India will you find a library where you can get the kind of books you get in the University of Chicago's library, right? It's like their collection is a fabulously comprehensive collection. And this whole project goes back to Robert Redfield and his Civilizations project. Right? Redfield wanted, and he had a huge millions of dollars of grant from Ford Foundation to map the civilizations of the world through the anthropology department. Right? The Department of Anthropology in Chicago is doing this work. Redfield is the top the leader of this whole project. So Redfield's own interest, scholarly interest, is in South America. But in Redfield's project, there are other people who deal with other parts. And the one who deals with India in that project is a man called Milton Singer. Milton Singer came to India, did a study, and wrote a book. It's called When a Great Tradition Modernizes. So he, in the process, introduced this idea that how does modernization work? Because one theory of modernization is the Marxist kind of idea of modernization, right? Which says modernity is this combination of capitalism and democracy and other kinds of ideas. Democracy, fascism, totalitarianism, these are the political forms. As Claude Lefort said, the three political forms of the modern world are democracy, totalitarianism, and fascism. Right? Marxist theories would say that capital, along with these kinds of political ideas, they travel around the world. So capital travels first, right? Capital goes here and there. So they colonizes various countries, various territories, because it wants to get the raw material from there for its own production activities, and so on. So it goes there and it destroys the older cultures. But because it's colonial rather than national, the state doesn't do anything to improve introduce democracy, or in other ways compensate for the ravages of capitalism, right? Because colonial rule is interested in underdeveloping those regions, because they don't want those regions to come on par with Europeans, because everything depends on keeping them in a backward state, because wages are low, raw material is cheap, everything, so in order to keep it in that state, you have to not improve their condition, right? You have to keep them in, so this is called the development of underdevelopment, right? So you actually produce a kind of underdevelopment. That's the dependency theory people talked about that. Now, Milton Singer and the anthropologists who are working on this project, they develop another kind of theory. It's an alternative to this dependency and other kinds of theoretical modes. What is their theory? They say that each culture modernizes according to its own internal genius. That is, modernity doesn't come and change them. They absorb modernity according to what kind of culture they have. So they are acting freely. That is, they are choosing how to modernize, depending on what kind of culture they already had before modernization. So you see, this is a very clear kind of two paradigms for thinking about modernization, etc. So when a great culture, when a great tradition modernizes, Milton Singer's book will argue that this great tradition is not just lying down and letting modernity take over. It is actively absorbing whatever comes, but selectively, and it is then producing a distinctive culture of its own. So this is, if you like, these are the two grand paradigms which have operated in South Asian studies throughout this, the last 50, 60, 70 years, ever since the Redfield project got going. Because around the same time the dependency theory also gets going, and this whole idea of modernization in the Marxist sort of understanding also is prevalent. So you have that. So in a way, that background is also important to the understanding of this, because as you see, both of them in some ways are talking about distinctions, what is distinctive about India, and how India in some ways Indians exercise a certain kind of selectivity, a certain choice in matters of modernization. So Ramanujan is a very engaging writer. He writes very beautifully, and he's a great poet, and he has a way with words. And here he says, let's think about it in terms of Stanislavski's dramatic theory. So he says how you can ask the question: is there an Indian way of thinking? In 4 ways. Well, depending on the emphasis, right? So if the emphasis on is there an Indian way of thinking, or is there an Indian way of thinking? Is there an Indian way of thinking, and is there an Indian way of thinking, and so on. So each one has a different emphasis and different meaning. So whether there is or not, and Ramanujan's overall thing is basically to talk about 2 sorts of possibilities. One is that Ramanujan is basically saying hard to decide these questions. These questions will keep coming up and they'll keep getting answered in different ways. So in other words, there's really no answer, no final answer, right? That is one thing that he says. So that means, in fact, it's an undecidable kind of question. But the second sort of conclusion that he seems to provide alongside this thing is, by and large, these societies have a kind of dominant tendency. They tend to go in one direction rather than the other direction. So he's got 2 directions. He says cultures in general, so he's now proposing a general theory of cultures. The general theory is that cultures can be either context free or context sensitive. This distinction is taken from linguistics, grammar, but he uses it here to say that this is a kind of general theory. It actually starts in section 4, right? Before that, what he has given you is all kinds of examples. Anyway, so what he does in the beginning is to give you 3 sorts of ways in which you can explore this question. How to explore this question? Is there an Indian way of thinking? Right? There is a very interesting passage. Since we were, to return once more to the sartorial theme which we have been pursuing in relation to economics. There is an interesting on page 42 at the bottom of the page. My father's clothes represented his inner life very well, he says. Where he says he was a South Indian Brahmin gentleman. He wore neat white turbans and a Sri Vaishnava caste mark. That is all these Hindu things, right? And a diamond earring. But he also wore ties, tutal, I don't know what that is, but tutal ties, cromens, buttons and collar studs, and English serge jackets over his muslin dhotis. So you can see that this is a hybrid kind of costume which combines Indian traditional and thing. And the other thing about his father is he is an astronomer. and a mathematician, very learned man, but he is also an astrologer who tells the future. And he reads Russell, Bertrand Russell, and then he goes and does his, worship of Hindu, conducts Hindu rituals. So the son asks him, how can you do this? How can you, is it a contradiction? So he says, the Gita is part of one's hygiene, and so on. So he sort of evades the question. But his point is, Ramanujan's point is, this is how it is. That Indian minds are notoriously unintegrated. They tend to be compartmentalized. They tend to have different compartments which don't have to reconcile with each other. They don't have to somehow negotiate. It's not a contradiction. So the idea is that the Western mind sort of militates against any contradiction, saying, if you believe this, how can you do this? Right? So the contradiction immediately becomes intolerable. For the Indian mind, as Ramanujan puts it, this is not a contradiction. Because the Indian mind can keep them separate in different compartments. So while you are reading Russell, you are reading Russell. While you are reading the sacred Hindu text, you are reading that. There is no communication between these two. Whatever, that's the idea, right? So, in other words, there is no integrity assumed, right? Inconsistency. This is a quality called inconsistency, no consistency, right? There is also a lack of universalism, right? That is, morality is decided contextually. So this is where Ramanujan compares Manu, who is an ancient Hindu lawgiver, who wrote a book on Hindu code of conduct for Hindus called Manusmriti. He compares Manu with Kant. So Manu says, for example, he'll say, if a Brahmin commits a sin, he should be given 20 lashes or something, let us say. But he says, but if the sun is, blazing, then it can be reduced to 10. If there is a cow grazing in the neighboring meadow, then it can be reduced to 5, like that. You see, it's a contextual in a very extreme sense, that if the person is undergoing some problem, then the thing. So every decision about right and wrong is modified, qualified by reference to all kinds of contextual factors. If the person who committed the sin is a Shudra, then he will get lashes. If he is a Kshatriya, he will get a fine, he will pay a fine, and so on. Right? So caste is a factor, region is a factor, the time of day can be a factor, and so on. Right? Anything can come in the way of. So on page 46, he gives you an example. According to Manu, a Kshatriya having defamed a Brahmana shall be fined 100 panas. A Vaishya will be fined 150 or 200. A Shudra will suffer corporal punishment. And the next one is even more interesting. An untruth spoken by people under the influence of anger, excessive joy, fear, pain or grief, by infants, by very old men, by persons laboring under a delusion, being under the influence of drink or by madmen, does not cause the speaker to fall. That means it's not a sin. Lying is not a sin if you are under the influence of drink or if you are mad. or if you are laboring under a delusion, and so on. Sometimes falsehood is better than truth, and so on. So this is contrasted with Kantian position on ethics, right? Which is act as if the maximum of your action were to become through your will a universal law of nature. So you should act according to what you consider to be the right way to act for the entire humanity in this position. You have to raise the decision. You have to act according to that which seems to you to be the universally valid kind of principle. So every act has to then be mediated by this reference to the universal principle, and then you act, right? You should not act according to your own individual desires and so on, right? Or any context. Like Kant had a famous example, right? If if a thief comes through your house and goes away, and if the policeman comes and says, where is these things, will you point in the right direction or not, right? This kind of thing. So for him, it is always a question of the right principle. What principle have you acted on according to? For Manu, it is whether it was morning or evening, or whether it was Brahmin or Kshatriya, or all of these things will go into deciding it. So in that sense, it is not universal, right? No universality is assumed here, right? So these are the kinds of differences that he is citing: a lack of universality and inconsistency, right? So having said that, he sums it up by saying, basically this difference is between cultures which are context free and cultures which are context sensitive. So European culture tends to think in context free ways. That is, they think about right and wrong and other matters without referring to context. So when they say what is right and what is wrong, they are not saying what is right in London and what is wrong in London. It's not like that, right? So as he quotes, he has a quote from Hegel, which says how Indians tend to. So yes, on page 46 at the right at the bottom, he says Hegel shrewdly noted this Indian slant. He says, while we say bravery is a virtue, the Hindus say bravery is a virtue of the Kshatriyas. So again, contextualize, specify, modify, qualify something. Nothing is universally true. So this lack of universality, right? So he says, of course, no culture is purely context free or purely context sensitive. They have both dimensions to some extent. But there is an overall, on page 47, he says in the section number 4, third paragraph, he says, I think cultures may be said to have overall tendencies tendencies to idealize and think in terms of either context free or context sensitive kind of rules. Actual behavior may be more complex, etc. In cultures like India's, the context sensitive kind of rule is the preferred formulation. Right? So that is so for further illustration of this whole point, which is that for instance on page 48 he says, when it comes to deciding on right and wrong behavior, they have this dharma. Dharma is what is right and the righteousness, right? Righteousness can also be divided into different types of righteousness, and they may come into conflict sometimes. So he says ashrama dharma says right conduct for the stage of life. So depending on whether you are a young person or a married person or a person who has given up married life and gone off to do penance, accordingly your right conduct changes. It changes at each stage. Then there is what is called swadharma, that is that which is right for me as an individual, who I am, right? Then there is something called apad dharma, that is in times of crisis, something, right conduct becomes something different. It can't be the same as for normal times, and so on, right? So they always are thinking about these kinds of modifications, qualifications for their ideas, for thought, right? So all of these, then he goes on to show how this kind of context sensitive thinking is to be found in all kinds of domains, not just in the ethical domain, but also in relation to music. So there is a time, certain music is meant for morning, certain music is meant for the evening, and so on. And then in medical matters, he says how, medicine also there are different things, seasons and other kinds of considerations, and so on. And how even things like caste will affect these considerations, etc., right? On the section 5 on page 54, the first paragraph, all societies have context-sensitive behavior and rules, but the dominant ideal may not be the context-sensitive, but the context-free. Egalitarian democratic ideals, Protestant Christianity espouse both the universal and the unique, insist that any member is equal to and like any other in the group. That is, whatever his context, birth, class, gender, age, place, rank, etc., a man is a man for all that. That is, in Western there is an idea that you are a man. That is, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, right? What does the Declaration of Rights of Man do? It says everybody who is born human has certain rights by virtue of being man. And then rights of citizen, that is different. Everybody by virtue of being a citizen of France will have the following rights. So there are two types of rights, the rights of man and the rights of citizen. The rights of man are natural rights and the rights of citizen are the political rights, right? So political rights are also universal, but their applicability is restricted by political boundaries, territorial boundaries. Whereas the rights of man are universal and are applicable to all human beings wherever they may be. So when the United Nations adopted a charter of the rights of humanity, right, of natural rights, it is these rights, these natural rights that everybody must enjoy, right? Not the citizenly rights, because the citizenly rights the United Nations cannot interfere, but there are rights which everybody must have because they are living on this planet as human beings, and those are the rights which the United Nations Charter will protect, right? So that kind of a thing, thinking where you abstract away all other qualities, whether you are from China or I am from India, somebody else, some America, you take away all of those things and you say they are all equal because they are all human. This is abstract, this is context free, right, thinking. But so while there are these two types, context free and context sensitive, they also have within themselves the opposite also. That is, the context free societies will have context sensitive aspects. So he gives the example of Wittgenstein's thinking, right? Because Wittgenstein is famously a thinker of the who questions these generalities and their way that they sort of produce meaning, or various other kinds of things which go against. So he even cites naturalism in literature, where you go into details of the context, right, as giving an example of that, as serving as an example. And in the Indian context, where it is context sensitivity that is dominant, there are context free thoughts also. The Bhakti movement, which again said all are equal, there is no caste and birth and gender don't matter, everybody is equal. That is a context free thinking within the Indian context, right? Now notice that he is saying that Bhakti is not dominant, Bhakti is not the prevalent. Bhakti can only be a counter to whatever exists. While he thinks that it is difficult to actually say that any country is purely one or the other, he does think that India tends to be by and large context sensitive. And as for the modernization question, he gives you a lot of interesting examples on page 55 in conclusion, on the section number 6, the bottom part. He says, in conclusion, I would like to make a couple of observations about modernization. Modernization in India can be seen as a movement from the context sensitive to the context free in all realms. An erosion of context, at least in principle. So he says, gives the example, Gandhi's watch replaced the almanac. That is, Gandhi used to have this watch which he put around his waist, which then got auctioned off at a great price in some London Sotheby's or something. But then he says, he is actually saying that you might think that modernization is making India more context free thinking rather than context sensitive. But he is not convinced about it. He thinks that he is skeptical about it, because he says while Gandhi's watch may seem like a modern thing, Gandhi quoted Emerson that consistency was the hobgoblin of foolish minds. So Gandhi continues to be inconsistent in the way that Indian culture is supposed to be inconsistent all through, right? And then the Indian Constitution, right, is obviously something that changes everything, right? It brings all kinds of context-free rules to bear on your political life and your social life. And now the tendency is to give no clue to birthplace, father's name, caste, subcaste, etc. I once found in a Kerala college roster 3 Joseph Stalins and 1 Karl Marx. And then in Andhra there is 1 Bobbili Winston Churchill and so on. So these are people adopting the names of great people. This is very common in India. Lenins, there are many Lenins and Stalins and Marx and so on. Just adopting the name as an ideal, And then he says, for instance, music, it's no longer played only in the morning or in the night. You can play, because you have recordings, you can play it anytime. And nobody bothers to find out whether this is a morning raga or an evening raga, right? They just do whatever they want. And then he gives this quotation from T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, which is basically to say that the Upanishads have been again reinterpreted for modern times and so on. So he admits that certain kinds of things are moving out of context sensitive culture into a context free kind of determination. But also he is maintaining a certain reserve about it. He is saying, well, it's not as is not some thoroughgoing modernization that's happening. It still continues to have context sensitive characteristics. Right? So, on page 57, when Indians learned quite expertly modern medicine, business, and technology, they compartmentalize these interests. And here is Singer, this is Milton Singer, the one I was talking about, right, earlier. So, compartmentalizing these interests, the new ways of thought and behavior do not replace but live along with older religious ways. So, in a way, the thing is it's not possible for modernity to completely transform this society, because they just compartmentalize. They say, I'll do modern science, I'll be very rational, but then when I get home, I'll do my own thing, you know, and they will never come into contact. So you can't actually do anything. So he is trying to actually say that this is a resilient kind of thing, culture, which will continue to be context sensitive rather than context free, by adopting the strategy of compartmentalization, right? So that is the burden of this essay. Perhaps we can discuss this now, and then, you know, after the break we'll go to Dipesh's article, right? Dipesh Chakravarti's article. How about that?
Maybe a simple, maybe naive explanation of context sensitivity. That is, in a rather traditional society, you have caste, you know, and many fears in terms of social structure. So, for example, a prince and say a peasant doing the same thing, but you cannot say the prince committed a crime. You know,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So maybe that's one thing, a sociological explanation of context sensitivity.
Right. Indeed. Yeah. Yeah. In other words, it's the context sensitivity is a reflection of power difference, power structures, right?
Right. So, but then in the way of the modernization, then you have to sort of, based on you have to get rid of these status.
Yes.
And based on a contract society,
right.
turn everybody into labor.
Exactly.
Also about compartmentalization, I think it can also explain in light of this, because each compartment actually is a context. So that's why you can have many different compartments, and so the reason why you can have seemingly incompatible, inconsistent content is only because it's sort of stored in a different
right.
container compartments,
Uh-huh.
and each compartment is a context. So, in that sense, they're not in contradiction, because you cannot compare two things in abstract.
Right.
Right. But two things has if each thing has its own context, then you cannot just abstract the content and say they're inconsistent.
No, but it's the situation here is one individual who is participating in
right.
both these contexts.
Contradictory.
So, from the point of view of a subjectivity, the contradiction will have to be, faced in the sense. So, therefore, compartmentalization in the psyche, as it were, to keep them apart, not to make them clash.
Yes, but there, and if you add, if we don't talk just about intellectual, we all talk about emotional.
Yeah.
Then, and if the emotional element is part of the context of the person, then it would make a different story, because I may have two seemingly contradictory thoughts, but actually there's one is attached to certain emotion, the other is attached to another kind of emotion.
Right, yeah.
And then maybe for me it's too painful or too complicated to confront the two, or to compare them, or whatever. So then in that sense may not be, in other words, contradiction is kind of an intellectual, it's pure intellectual, or
right.
Right. So, but we are more complicate human beings. So, in other words, contradiction is only from a certain point of view when you only consider intellectual matters without emotion.
Without emotion.
I want to address this question too. But no, it's interesting. But first, just a quick comment. This dichotomy or this comparing the West and the East is also very popular in China.
Yeah, right.
Early
Okay.
modern stage. They took it as their self-definition.
Right.
There are all kinds of debate between 东方文明, 西方文明. So they define 东方 or Chinese culture as more spiritual. And, and not necessarily religious, but spiritual.
But maybe inspired by Tagore too.
Yeah, sure, that's it.
Could be,
The
yeah.
circulation, yeah, right. The circulation of this knowledge through India and through British education or delineation of this what East-West culture or the civilization and barbarianism. So, but I want to come back to this compartmentalization. I think psyche, of course, is complex, but the problem here, I think, is I once called it intellectual syncretism. It's like religious syncretism, but it's actually intellectual syncretism. Like they could put Stalin and Marx and Churchill together, but this is only on the one case. But for one thinker or one maybe journal, for example, in early modernist China, they could introduce a nationalist socialist. National socialist propaganda along with democratic and along with other forms. So they are not aware of the conflicts or the contradictions within this each knowledge system or the logic, but they embrace it and they rationalize it and they translate it into Chinese and add Confucian terms. So this is what I also found very interesting. This compartmentalization doesn't mean they do not traverse. It's in one text. It could be in one text, and then or in one journal, for example, 东方杂志, and in one issue, the same. Okay. But they could bring in. But it seems that they are addressing similar issues, but they could allow different opposite theories or logics to merge, like collage, into one text. So, but that's the way modernization was undergoing.
It's actually extremely difficult to discuss in a way. You either accept, or if you're thinking historically, then what would happen?
That's what I think, yeah. It's indeed the crucial.
Linguists tend to,
Yeah.
I don't know what sort of linguistic theory.
He said linguistics come anthropology also. Anthropology is also very much present there. Milton Singer, that whole, the Chicago anthropology project is very strongly in the background here.
Right.
Yeah.
So this type of distinction, in a way, by definition, essentially is then very difficult to operate. In the sense that, is he talking about also classical, pre-modern European, is also context-free?
That's right. Yeah. Exactly.
It's very difficult to.
Yeah. That is I think the crucial issue here is.
But on the other hand,
Yeah.
There has also been argument trying to suggest that there is, for instance, it's a different, whatever you want to call, cultural civilization has its own mode of operation, mode of thinking, and so on and so forth. Right? So, to what extent, unless we want to completely relativize, like this is largely
Right. Yeah.
What's the better way to address these issues?
Yeah. No, there are two things. One is what, yeah, what is the, there are the better ways to address it is one of the things we have to think about. And I think this distinction which you have raised, that is crucial. That is, historically, you can say that, if you go back in time, European civilization will have manifestations of context sensitivity, as much as here, because Greeks, if you go to Greeks, like he cites Plato, but Greeks had no conception of man because they said slaves by nature don't, Aristotle is very clear, slaves are not part of what the free, they are not human, they are not the ones who, get. So slaves are excluded from any universal concepts that he produces, right? So in that sense, this thing is not. So how do you think differently about it, which is historically informed way? So the problem there is, as we will see when we go to the Dipesh and then to Nandi and so on, history itself is then problematized, saying history is a Western way of thinking. So then it's. So in other words, you are duty bound to treat it as a cultural rather than a historical question, almost. So then that's the question. What is happening in terms of producing this picture? Redfield's whole project was to produce this picture of distinctive cultures and how they are distinct all over the world, and how they are inviolably, sort of distinctive cultures. So there was also some kind of Cold War dimension to it. This whole anthropological project and so on. So there are many complications, in that.
Too many assumptions. How should I say? We may need to bracket, or for instance, it's obviously a struggle over, for instance, universality.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So who has the control over it?
Right, yeah.
By now, people seem to, at least the strong hand, would not keep up with this question, right? But then later you get all these people coming into the picture, trying to say, we are more universal than you are.
Mm-hmm.
So this is one step,
Right.
Human rights and universal and so on. But that already assumes something, right? I think it's a very difficult issue. Unless we want to bracket this, how this come into the picture, in what way, at what point this become a term adopted.
No, it comes. This question of compartmentalization, which you were raising earlier, it comes back in a different way, in a different context, which is when you talk about corruption in India, which is a very big question, because there is this corruption is completely almost everywhere. There is no there is no domain of public life in which there is no corruption, right? From the lowest to the highest. So in India recently, there has been a series of these kinds of scandals about Commonwealth Games, about public works, about 2G, 3G, these spectrum auctions, all kinds of everything. So everybody, so corruption also, now suddenly, they say that you can explain corruption by compartmentalization, right? So when you do that, this Ramanujan's explanation of compartmentalization seems very innocent. It seems like a cultural trait. You do this and you do that and so on. But when you put it in a social context, in a relation to something like compartmental, like a corruption, saying, why is it that so many people are so corrupt? It's because for them, what you do here doesn't matter, because they separate these things into compartments, and they don't. Their moral life is compartmentalized, separate from the economic activities. So economic activity is like you do whatever you need to do to get your wealth, secure your wealth. So, then you come into another world in which you are moral. So, that morality will operate there. And that has nothing to do with whether your money was earned corruptly or not. Because corruption is defined by the modern sector, not by the traditional sector. So, but your morality is from the traditional. Because your moral being is defined by your community, not your nation. So, it's and the community doesn't ask, where did you get all this wealth? How did you get it? And so on. It says, you are wealthy, so therefore you have a certain status in the community. A high status, right?
Can I ask maybe a silly question? So I was sort of reading a lot of Gandhi stuff, and I remember he told a story about the Hindus and the Muslims living together in some part of India, but somehow something happened, so many things happened, and they ended up fighting and killing. A lot of violence happened, and so when I read Ramanujan,
yeah.
and the idea of Indians being able to live in contradiction, right? Something must have happened for these contradictions to spark, to become violent. And I was thinking, maybe is it more effective to kind of think about it in terms of the effects of colonialism and nationalism, and how it makes this kind of Indian living in contradiction somehow not livable anymore.
Well, first, one thing is,
This is, it says Indian, but it means, he means Hindu. That's one thing one should keep in mind. Yeah, because it's not, as you can see, there is no reference to anything, other than, Hinduism here. It's Hindu thought, Manu and, onwards. So, the first thing is that this, first of all, it purifies the whole Indian context so that it becomes Indian equals Hindu. And then it has no way, it has no possibilities, it has no capacity to explain that juxtaposition. But Nandi will actually try to explain it within these kinds of terms. So, it is, yeah. Because what Nandi does is to oppose communal harmony as a traditional Indian practice to modern secularism, saying secularism is the source of the problem. Otherwise, Indians are perfectly capable of living together even when they are different religions. So, that will be Nandi's way of. So, Nandi continues in this vein, but he answers new types of questions. He addresses new problems. So, it's a different kind of, yeah.
It's a distinctively different culture constituted by culture itself or by system. And the system is a contingency of historical processes.
no, that's contingency of historical processes is
Precisely not factored in here. Not factored into this thinking. Right? It's not, but it is, this trend of thinking is very powerful in India. That is, in spite of all the contradictions, you can point out many faults, but it continues to have a certain cachet. It just continues to be have a certain appeal. So that itself becomes then interesting as to why that is so. Right? What historical explanations can one find for such a thing? Now, is it a necessity of post-colonial existence that you have to sort of cling to something like this?
My own answer is very simple. As long as you still juxtapose these India and the West, things bound to happen this way.
right. Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
If you bring in a third party,
Yeah.
I'll quote you one sentence. Right? 44. They say the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 from top. They all seem to agree on one thing: Indian trait of hypocrisy. Indians do not mean what they say, and say different things at different times, and so on.
Yeah.
Right? This is the, once you bring in a party, Koreans say the same thing to Chinese.
Right.
Chinese do not mean what they say.
Right.
Right? They're hypocritical. Right? So and so on and so forth.
Yeah, yeah.
So, but how do you, once this is brought in, then I think it will be a different system or something, I don't know. So
Yeah.
all relative, but in this sense, I think the problem of universalism become the police. Difficult to set things in relation, in motion.
Yeah.
That's how I feel, But then if that, I don't know how to explain that. If similar utterance, but depends on who is actually uttering that.
Who is saying it?
Right, the Korean saying this about is vis-a-vis these two possible
Right.
historical culture or whatever. So I actually don't know how this can be, put more productively. Because that's still the case. It's still the China vis-a-vis the
Right.
then very similar situation because unless these want to be done more so-called scientifically, like for instance you're a linguist, then deal with the grammatical question of language, right? In that sense.
No, I mean, you see, he's a linguist or folklorist, anthropologist. Dipesh Chakravarti is a historian, and Nandi is, something else. So, there are many others. There are literary critics, there are social scientists. So, different types of people argue the, similar points with using different,
theories or methods, right? So the question then which remains is, what is the compulsion? For me, I mean, in some senses, that's what is interesting because this is a paradigm that runs through these things. And it seems, in some ways, the question of freedom is tied to this. What is the compulsion to revert to a kind of compartmentalization theory and to thereby, sustain this sort of idea of a difference between the, East and West and so on. In a way, the more questions of the colonial psyche begin to become relevant here. Are these compulsions of subjectivity that need to be addressed on that level, right? So the experience of colonization, and its long-term after effects, as it were, right? Can we treat this as an instance of that? As possibly, the production of the distinction is then because there are many developments which go against all of these kinds of claims, right? In everyday life, things keep happening. You say, Indians are by nature XXX, and then tomorrow in the paper you will see something which is totally contradicts such a claim. And then you have to overcome that evidence. But people do overcome it. Somehow or the other you maintain. So in that sense, it seems to be a kind of discursive supplement which somehow sustains a national sense of belonging, or a sense of national belonging, right? A kind of thing. So in that sense, the problem is also a descriptive problem, because that's in fact Ramanujan finally sort of is very tentative about everything. Even though he finally his thrust is clear, he wants to appear to be tentative because you can't really. So he says it is a description, not an argument, right? And in that very clarification that it's a description and not an argument, there is a certain skepticism about his own sort of argument, which he won't address, but is uses he uses it to hedge. So, what is the solution in that instance, right? Because it seems psychic reality question when maybe we should actually because Dipesh Chakravarti brings up this psychoanalyst called Sudhir Kakar, who has written extensively on India.
Maybe just one.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, as long as there is.
I was still thinking is the compulsion for to compartmentalize
Uh-huh.
different branches of
Right.
either a knowledge or system, and also the question of the syncretism that I was thinking as a subject position, the need to rationalize or the need to integrate actually contradictory system for the subjects. That it could be a colonial subject or it could be a different form of subject, but the need of compulsion or the capacity to synchronize, to do that, it's just like a temple, you place different statues standing for different belief systems, but the belief systems could be a disguise for a different, another belief system, local and foreign. But altogether, it's for the subject's space, a temple to hold the space.
Okay, as a placeholding kind of function.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
But it's
There
just
has been that story, three in one, right? 三教合一. Right? It's a 3 in 1. It's like the temple.
it's there cultural religious syncretisms happening everywhere, right? Like in local Chinese temple, we
Right,
have aborigines, some sort of spirit, ancestral spirit, posed as saints
Right.
in the Catholic Church, but it's
Okay.
but
right.
intellectually it's more complex.
No, it's a see the assumption there is the
Modern subject. That is, why is there no contradiction experienced by this subject? Why does Ramanujan's father not feel that he is doing something contradictory? Right? So the thing is, in the 19th century, for instance, there were many social reformers. They used to say there should be no child marriage, and then they would go and marry a child. But they were not allowed to go free. People said, what nonsense are you doing? What is this contradiction in your practice and your thinking? And they had to answer, right? So in other words, you can say that the person compartmentalizes or whatever, but society is not sort of keeping quiet also. Some people are raising their voices, others are saying something. So in other words, there are tendencies. So the compartmentalizing trend is coexisting with a more integral kind of trend, which will not tolerate contradiction, right? So these are in existence. Both of them are in existence, but somehow one seems to be more essentially Indian than the other. So in other words, that means the modern subject who emerges in some ways to transcend these contradictions and to be answerable, to be sovereign, right? To be answerable for your own, to be answerable for your own deeds. This is modern, right? Because you are sovereign. What you do, you cannot blame it on somebody else, right? You have to take responsibility for your own actions and so on. So it's only in that context that the integration of the self becomes historically possible to conceive. So you can very well say, again going back to the, you can ask, is it historical or cultural, right? That's the. But it's interesting that it's so difficult because, Dipesh is a historian, and yet he will also have some kind of. The next text is Dipesh Chakravarti's, one of the texts. The other one we'll read next week, as I said. And Dipesh Chakravarti is arguing against what he terms hyper-rationalism in Indian historical thinking. And he has a point insofar as, Sumit Sarkar, he is criticizing the writings of a historian called Sumit Sarkar, very major historian whose book Modern India was for many decades the standard textbook for modern history, modern Indian history, and whose work also covers the Swadeshi movement, which we talked about earlier. So Sumit Sarkar mounts a very facile criticism of subaltern studies. He says subaltern studies people are abandoning enlightenment values and principles, and they are endorsing and promoting what he calls the religious dimension of social life by saying that religion plays a very important role in politics and it should be taken seriously. So Sumit Sarkar finds this whole argument very dangerous. He says this is because in India the Hindu fundamentalism is beginning to raise its ugly head. So Sumit Sarkar's argument is that this kind of writing will encourage further the Hindu fundamentalists and the which is he calls the fascist developments. So, but he also traces the origins of this kind of thinking to what is called postmodernism. So, fragmentation, the subaltern studies people started using the word fragment very frequently. Gyanendra Pandey wrote a piece called In Defense of the Fragment. And then Partha Chatterjee gave the title The Nation and Its Fragments to one of his books, very influential major book. And Dipesh Chakravarti in this article defends again the idea of the fragment. So this fragment became a kind of symptom of what the subaltern studies people were after, something new that they were after. They were trying to articulate something new. But at the same time, it was obviously, the term was derived from postmodern thinking, and as we all know, it's from Lyotard's, theory of postmodernism, where he talks about the fragmentation, and also other people like Jean-Luc Nancy, etc., have used that term. So basically, the argument is that the grand narratives have all collapsed. The big grand narratives are, the idea, a Marxist idea of class struggle as one grand idea, in which the proletariat will lead the people to a communistic society. And other bourgeois ideas are progress and, scientific progress, how science and technology can be employed for the benefit of mankind and scientific. So they believed in this sort of narrative of progress. continuous and irreversible human progress towards some better state. So these narratives, according to postmodern thought, were their time was over, that they had become obsolete, because in the new world something, the people were far more, getting more locally centered. People are looking at their own surroundings. They were no longer depending upon these grand narratives put out by world leaders to save them, but they were more in terms of the previous essay, they were say more contextually oriented, right? So as we know, Foucault, for instance, says these grand struggles, proletarian struggle is not the way to go. You have to locally, struggles have to be local. So for instance, he says prison reform, right? A struggle which is specific to the conditions of the prison, or a struggle which is specific to the institution of medicine and so on. So that's the theory, right? So here they are employing the term fragment in a particular, in a slightly different context. We can also discuss at the end of this, whether the postmodern idea of the fragment and the Dipesh Chakravarti's idea of the fragment are the same, or is he, contributing something new to its meaning, right? It's whether because in fact, he says that it's different, right? But the immediate context for this essay is that the Sumit Sarkar is attacking subaltern studies. Sumit Sarkar was himself a member of subaltern studies initially, but he leaves protesting, saying that these people have become very complacent. They have given up on all the Marxist and progressive ideals, and therefore it's become something very different from what it was meant to be. So he leaves, and then he writes this critique, which actually, if you read the critique, it's a very facile critique. It's not very intellectually rigorous, and it's just, there are such critiques happening in America and Europe. So he just simply voices the same critique without really doing his own work, in terms of thinking it through. He is just aligning himself with those people who attack postmodernism, basically. So it is, and Dipesh Chakravarti is justifiably sort of pissed off by this kind of argumentation, and he takes it, and he does a very effective job of showing that Sumit Sarkar is very much out of his depth, that he is really not thinking, and but what he then does is he moves on to say that there is in India, as a result of colonial domination, the Indian intellectual has tended to adopt certain hyper-rational posture. So he now gives a general theory of hyper-rationalism as a product of colonial domination. And what is the hyper-rationalism that he is talking about? On page 22, hyper-rationalism and the colonial modern. That's what we will look at now. What he first says is, in India, you look around you, everybody uses, their religion is everywhere. So people never, seem to distinguish political issues from religious issues, right? So Dipesh's point is that when it is the case, why are we not attending to this problem? Why are we not talking about it and saying there is religion in our politics? There are our political agents. Political agents in India are, not all of them, but many of them have a tendency to mix religious discourse and political discourse. It's a particular kind of, observable characteristic of Indian, thinking, Indian political thinking, that they tend to mix it. So Dipesh Chakravarti's point is, first of all, that when these Marxist and other progressive historians see this, they regard it as a kind of negative development which should be condemned, because it goes against reason, it goes against progressive ideals, it goes against all that is good. Dipesh Chakravarti's point is that if it is prevails as a historian, it is your duty to attend to it, to be able to explain it, to have something to say that is concrete about it, instead of taking refuge in for certain formulas of enlightenment reason, right? And it is actually the case that that is exactly what is happening. That is, they are taking recourse to these formulas of enlightenment reason and saying, this is all bad, it's it's bad for our democracy, it's bad for our progress, and so on, right? So in other words, they are not attending to the question, why is it so? What makes our polity so different? What are the reasons? And if you stop judging them by saying, oh, it's becoming religious and it's very bad, and if you study without prejudices, then you might find that using religious discourses you can still produce a politically interesting and humanly positive political program, right? You cannot prejudge saying if there is any element of religious discourse in a political movement, it is by definition something bad, right? That is the kind of assumption that the progressive historians are making. And subaltern studies has in some ways taken it upon itself to say, to open up the field, to say this is not how historians should operate, that there is a need to attend to the specificity of these claims, and also there is no need to assume that all religious discourses in political life are necessarily reactionary or backward looking or superstitious, etc. Now, you may remember the essay we read a week ago in the that is the Dalit readings, where there was a Pradeepan. He talks about how in the state of Kerala, most of the reformist movements were religious in character, right? Caste groups formed spiritual societies, and in that spiritual society they had a kind of revamped Hinduism, they transformed, or Christianity, and through this religious idiom they expressed emancipatory ideals, right? So in other words, those are things which demonstrate very clearly that the presence of religious idiom is not to be taken as by itself something, So so this is all very so even Sumit Sarkar will probably not grant this point when it comes to 19th century developments, but when it comes to more recent things, there is this tendency to say religion off limits to. So on the page 23, the quotation which is from Sumit Sarkar's book on the Swadeshi movement, he says, what seems indisputable is that the otherworldly pull of religion tended to assert itself particularly at moments of strain and frustration. Religion, cultivated at first as a means to the end of mass contact and stimulation of morale, could all too easily become an end in itself. So he is saying, he is giving what Dipesh Chakravarti calls an instrumentalist view of religion. Says sometimes they used it, which is okay, but when it became the dominant, then it's not. Then it's becomes a problem. And then he cites Aurobindo, whom we have read in the past. The process of inversion is reflected clearly in Aurobindo's famous Uttarpada speech where he says, this is Aurobindo saying now, I spoke once before with this force in me, and I said then that this movement is not a political movement, and nationalism is not politics but a religion, a creed, a faith. I say it again today, but I put it in another way. I say no longer that nationalism is a creed, religion or faith. I say it is the Sanatana Dharma, that is ancient Hindu sacred religion, which is for us nationalism. So in other words, Aurobindo is now completely redefining politics as religion. He is saying Indian nationalism is nothing but a religion. It's the same as the Hindu religion of ancient past. So he is saying that this is the danger of national movements adopting a religious idiom. That while they may be useful as instrumental use, if you say use a religious idiom to talk to the people, but if you keep your political goals separate, then it's fine. But if they mix up and you say religion is the dominant thing, the most important thing, then you have serious trouble, right? That is the Dipesh Chakravarti is saying, but this is precisely what is distinctive about Indian political culture, that there tends to be this kind of mix up of religion and politics. But what according to him he does, that is Sumit Sarkar does, is on page 24 towards the top. Sarkar looks on history as the story of a perpetual struggle between the forces of reason and humanism on the one side and those of emotion and faith on the other, and we are left in no doubt as to which side Sarkar himself is on. That is, as far as Sumit Sarkar is concerned, history is nothing but the story of the fight between the progressive and the reactionary elements. The progressive elements are secular and rational, the reactionary elements are religious and emotional. So in other words, when he writes his histories, he always writes with this bias in mind that is reflected in this assumption, right? Right. And Dipesh then traces this kind of paradigm to the history of colonial education, where Christianity and Western rationality got together. So Christian missionaries used to teach science, saying that the Indian people need to be educated out of their superstition, therefore we should teach them scientific ideas and so on, right? Now we can I'm sure you can think of some questions to pose to that, whether scientific education is good or not, whether it comes from Christians or somebody else, is it worthwhile or not? But that's what we'll come back to. But what Dipesh's point is that there is a certain what he calls the paralysis of imagination, which is the result of this hyper-rational positioning on the side of these scientific ideas, which where you take an aggressively hostile attitude towards religion. So in other words, they are missing the actual the nature of the political life in India when they do that, right? On page 26 there is a very interesting example of Rajendra Lal Mitra, which we will just go through the example and then we will come back to it for discussion. The story is basically that Rajendra Lal Mitra is writing a history, right? He's an Orientalist and Indologist, and he is writing about blood sacrifice. So as an intellectual in the colonial times, he is a very hyper-rational person, writing a rational history. But he includes a personal story, anecdote, which is that when he fell ill, his father made a blood sacrifice for his recovery. So in other words, this is a short circuit, the very short-circuited foreshortening of this relation between the rational self. That this Rajendra Lal Mitra is a rational subject who is writing a book, right? And he is employing very rational modes of thinking, and he is giving a history and so on. In the middle of it, an anecdote in which he says, "My own father did this," and then he says, the last sentence of that paragraph, "Whatever may be thought of it by persons brought up under a creed different from that of the Indo-Aryans, I cannot recall to memory the fact that the blood sacrifice without feeling the deepest emotion for the boundless affection which prompted it." So in other words, he is revealing his emotional attachment to his father, which was enhanced by this blood sacrifice. That is, he is saying, as a ritual practice, of course, he would condemn it in his rational self. But when he looks at his own life, he can't help, feeling a profound sort of affection, a deep, intimate sense of, love for his father, because his father, did it for his benefit, for his sake. So in other words, these things cannot be, reason cannot sort of do away with the, emotional attachments, and the reasons for them. Dipesh is presenting it as a question of how the hyper-rational subject marginalizes the emotional sort of life. So, such is the nature of the hyper-rational historian of modern times. So, it leads to a failure, page 27, Sarkar's failure to give us insights into the religious that constantly erupts into the political in Indian modernity. But it's not a personal failure, it is a failure of hyper-rationalism, a failure that marks the intellect of the colonial modern. And the next point is that this whole idea that Indian modernity is incomplete, that somehow it was becoming modern, but it remained incomplete. It never became fully modern, which is again an interestingly, widespread but problematic idea, that something can be incomplete in this sense. So here, this dependency theory is what is, sort of mobilized. That is, the argument is that Indian modernity was sailing along very well, would have been, by now complete, except for the fact that colonial rule was against it. Colonials underdeveloped India. So, underdevelopment theory was used to explain this. And Dipesh Chakravarti's point there is, but underdevelopment theory is no longer very prevalent. So, how do you then deal with such a thing? Another dimension of Dipesh Chakravarti's response is to say that they are actually the one that enlightenment itself, if you look closely at enlightenment and the history of enlightenment and the thought of enlightenment, it has very diverse components to it. It's not one thing, it's not just some scientific rationality or, but he says the Indian intellectuals have tended to reduce enlightenment reason to a set of formulas, and they only think about enlightenment as application of those formulas, those rationalist formulas. They don't see that enlightenment in fact was something within, in which there were conflicts within the enlightenment thinkers, between them, that they argued back and forth about many things, right? Midnight's Children is also mentioned here, Salman Rushdie's, where this couple, this husband and wife, who are the grandfather and grandmother of the protagonist, Salim Sinai, who is Adam Aziz and his wife, and he is a very rational person and she is a very devout Muslim. And well, there are many interesting episodes, anecdotes about it, but what is cited here on page 30 on top, the first paragraph, is that his children are educated by a Muslim Maulvi, which is a religious teacher, who was appointed by the mother. One day the father simply dismisses this Maulvi, and he says he was teaching them to hate wife. He tells them to hate Hindus and Buddhists and Jains and Sikhs and who knows what other vegetarians. So he, because he was teaching them to hate, this is his excuse, he says, he dismisses, because he is a rational thinker. He believes that Muslims should now give up their prejudices, Muslim beliefs, and become more secular and rational. Dipesh Chakravarti is presenting it as a kind of the subordination of religion to reason, right? So in this story, the wife becomes a subaltern, a believing, devoted subaltern who is dominated by her rationalist husband, and who takes decisions on his own about something in which she had a role to play. So in other words, he negates her agency. He has no time to discuss it with her. He just dismisses and then gives an explanation, right? And moving on, you have a discussion of Eugene Weber's book, Peasants into Frenchmen. It's a very interesting book which shows how when when France became a republic in the late 18th century, after the revolution, much of France didn't even know that. The peasants were not even conscious of it, that they belonged to some new country called France, the Republic of France. And he shows how, Eugene Weber's book basically shows how from that time on to almost, it takes more than 100 years, almost well into the 20th century, for France to finally become homogeneously one country. That is, so they have to do all kinds of things. They have introduced education in French, they have to eliminate all the local languages, right? And they have to have an administration which covers the entire area. They have to make people go to the courts set up by the French government, etc. So all kinds of processes, right, which over many years, decades, will convert all of these people into Frenchmen, French people. So this is a process, and Eugene Weber says it was, so he compares it to, he says it's internal colonization. Within France, the French government is colonizing the rest of the people and over time converting them into French people. So in other words, they are in France, but they are not yet French in the new sense in which French, to what it means to be French, right? So that is the story. Now what Dipesh Chakravarti is saying here is, this is one of the most interesting parts of the this essay, which actually comes after discussing Eugene Weber. He comes to the next section, which is history as democratic dialogue with the subaltern. But before that, one second. Yes, on page 32. One of the most interesting ideas, which I think is crucial for many aspects of Indian contemporary life, which is this kind of what you might call a dislocation, of subject and object and the positions they occupy. Because what Eugene Weber is saying, because it's a slightly tricky idea, let me try and explain it. What Eugene Weber is saying is that for France to turn all its citizens into Frenchmen, all the people within its borders into Frenchmen, French citizens, it took 150 years. Right? So, here is France, and all of those people were, there are these the different, some of them spoke different languages. France had many local languages, and they also had different, some Protestant elements, peasantry, which had no conception of the new political unit that they were part of. So, it takes 150 years, and he calls it internal colonization. But Eugene Weber is writing his history in late 20th century, right? So, this story is already over, it's history. He is writing from the point of view of a France which is completely Frenchified, which has become, where everybody now recognizes themselves as French citizens. Finished, right? It's the story of a finished process. What Dipesh Chakravarti is saying is, in India, when the historian looks at contemporary events, he is not telling a finished story. That is, it is still going on. So, he says you can see, and I want to more focus on the idea of the gaze here, the historian's gaze. What kind of thing is it? It's a dilemma, it's a kind of predicament of the colonial, historian of the post-colonial situation. And says at the bottom of page 31, concluding the comments on Weber, it says, Weber is very conscious that this process was a very violent process, right? That the process of converting all these people into Frenchmen was a violent process. It involved coercion, it involved forcing them to give up their local language and learning French, and making everybody come to use the French courts, etc. So, it's coercion, but the coercion is over, and now France is a better place. So, for Weber, according to as Dipesh puts it rightly, for Weber a happy ending has come, right, has resulted. Therefore, the story of the past is told as a bad, a story of violence, but a violence which is already over. Now, Dipesh Chakravarti says, what should we do? Because in our context, the violence of modernity is still happening. Because it's not over. We are not writing from a post facto point, right? So, beginnings, however ugly, do not matter for Weber. I am on page 31 bottom. Beginnings do not matter for Weber. They cannot act as a site from which to develop a critique of the present. For he tells and believes in a story of progress. His teleology saves him from having to be critical. But actually Weber is critical. I mean, if he says internal, he is himself saying that it was a violent process. So, he is critical, but it is a finished story. That is what he is saying. But since it resulted in a happy French republic, he is not complaining about it. Now, here on page 32, right at the top, is where he turns to India after having discussed Weber, and this is the interesting part. where can we, historians of a third world country like India, where the distinction between the founding and the preserving modes of violence in the functioning of the law is hard to sustain, anchor such facile optimism? Eugene Weber is optimistic because the founding violence is over. Now there is only the maintaining violence. That is, when a state is set up, there is a violence of foundation. That is, you have to suppress people, you have to make people surrender, submit to your laws and all that. That is the founding violence. Once it is all done, all you have to do is maintain it, right? So, France has reached that stage where all they need to do is maintain whatever is going. But in India, it is not that situation, right? There is no such distinction. The founding violence and the maintaining violence are continuing. The process of making peasants or individuals into Indians takes place every day before our eyes. It is not a process with a single or simple characteristic, nor is it without any material benefits to the people involved. But were we to convert particular benefits, which often do create problems in their turn, into some kind of grand narrative of progress, it would leave us with a few important and nagging problems. He says, if a certain kind of colonizing drive is inherent to the civilizing, modernizing project, and if one were, in one's point of view, to side uncritically with this project, how would one erect a critique of imperialism? That is, to side with the modernizing drive, knowing that it is being done by a colonizing power, and that you are now siding, you are giving up on the critique of imperialism if you do that, right? So, the next paragraph, let me repeat my point once more. If it is true that Enlightenment rationalism requires as its vehicle the modern state and its accompanying institutions, the instruments of governmentality, and if this entails a certain kind of colonizing violence anyway, then one cannot uncritically welcome this violence and at the same time maintain a critique of European imperialism. So, except on some kind of essentialistic or indigenous ground. So, this is an extraordinary dilemma that faces the Indian historian, isn't it? There seems to be a kind of log jam. You're caught in a non-coincidence of subject and historical event. Because see, I think what is at stake here is, as far as historian is concerned, the Indian historian and Eugene Weber, who is the French historian, are on the same plane. They both occupy this modern world, of historical discourse. They are intellectuals with the same equipment. Sumit Sarkar, Dipesh Chakravarti are as accomplished historians as Eugene Weber. But Eugene Weber has to write about a country which has achieved something, and where the one kind of violence has completed its course and finished. Whereas this Indian historian has to deal with a situation where that historical process is still continuing. So, your eyes are watching something different from what actually, from where you are located. So, in other words, there is a dislocation. You are located in some other sort of thing. Now, my question would be whether we are looking at a kind of historicist fallacy here, right? In saying that, is Dipesh committing a historicist fallacy? It would be one question. We can come back to it, right? The last section, where Dipesh Chakravarti proposes an alternative to this kind of progressivist, hyper-rational history writing, where he says a democratic dialogue with the subaltern. He says this, what is required for the subaltern historian is to engage in dialogue, and it has to be a genuinely open-ended dialogue, and he gives you different versions that are possible. That is, one is that in such a situation where the historian is in a different place, historian belongs to a privileged class and the subaltern is in a different situation, where the subaltern's political struggles belong to a different kind of historical time, as it were. The Chakravarti's point is that the historian has to not impose a progressivist framework on it. But he is also conscious of one thing, which is that people like us, privileged people, when we say something, it automatically acquires a pedagogic significance. That is, you are teaching people. So the whole Gramsci question, right? What is Gramsci saying? Gramsci is saying that the subaltern has his own worldview, but it lacks something. So as communists, the communist necessarily sees the subaltern as the agent of history, but to become that agent of history, the subaltern has to be taught something by this Marxist or communist intellectual, the leader, right? The leader comes from a different, this lack. So in other words, all progressivist intellectual activities assume that there is a lack in the subaltern. That is dialogic, but it's not an open-ended dialogue. It's dialogic because pedagogy is a form of dialogue, right? Dialogue, in the sense that the teacher and the student exchange and so on. So the subalterns will be taught new ideas about the world, about proletarian agency, about revolution, etc. And the subaltern will ask questions and slowly get educated into the new discourse of revolution, etc. Right? So it's dialogue, but it's a dialogue in which the intellectual always has upper hand. Right? There is no doubt about it. That is, the leader who gives the line is the one who is dominant in that. The subaltern is necessarily in the subordinate position of learning. So it's not open-ended dialogue. So he says, to be open-ended, I am on page 33 bottom, to be open-ended, a dialogue must be genuinely non-teleological. That is, you can speak to the subaltern, but not in a language in which you have already proposed an end to be reached. So you talk, you assume that there is a political problem, and you come from somewhere, and the subaltern is coming from somewhere else, but you exchange ideas, but on an equal terms, without saying, I have an idea and you must learn, something, and you must go with me. So non-teleological. One must not presume on an a priori basis that whatever position our political philosophy suggests as correct will be vindicated as a result of this dialogue. Page 34. For a dialogue can be genuinely open only under one condition, that no party puts itself in a position where it can unilaterally decide the final outcomes of the conversation. So that is one possibility, right? The other is, he quotes from Gramsci saying, that while subaltern social groups are necessarily fragmented and episodic, they do have a tendency to unification, because you need a unifying principle, right, for people to come together from different sides. So Gramsci says subaltern groups do have a tendency to unification, but they never realize it. So that's why the communist leader has to go to them and so on. So he says the other way to do it is not to teach, but to let that tendency to unification become fruit, bear fruit. That is, to actually yield some new thing. That means the subaltern's own idea of the whole should be allowed to exercise its dominance. So allow this, so in other words, create the conditions in which the subaltern's tendency to unification can actually mature into something which is a new ideology for struggle. So that is one. But that's also not very radical. Dipesh Chakravarti proposes finally a third thing, which he says is, what is the third thing? It is a radical sort of affirmation of everything that the subaltern stands for. So, on the last line of page 35, moving on to 36, says, last sentence, if a totalizing mode of thinking is needed for us to imagine the state theoretically, what kind of political imagination and institutions could sustain themselves on the basis of a thought that joyously embraced the idea of the fragment? The subaltern group is a fragment, but you joyously embrace it. Whatever it is, you endorse it. You say the subaltern is right, whatever, and so on, without asking any questions, without saying is it progressive, is it going to be according to, agree with my principles and all, nothing of those kinds, right? It's an idea of the political that did not require us to imagine totalities. So, give up on totalities altogether and only endorse the fragment, which is the burden of this last. So that is the main, sort of content of this. An openness radical, and which is radical, to go to the subaltern in order to learn to be. That is, this is another thing he wants. He wants a historical practice which involves learning from the subaltern, rather than always telling the subaltern what is right. The subaltern is no longer the citizen in the making. Citizen in the making is somebody who is not yet citizen, something is lacking, you move him into citizenship. Not that. But the subaltern is the ideal figure of the person who survives actively, joyously on the assumption that the statist instruments of domination will always belong to somebody else and never aspires to them. This also is interesting, that he never aspires to them, to political power and so on. So there is also a certain kind of renunciative quality to this subaltern, as Dipesh Chakravarti is profiling him. Right? So altogether, it is. So for the last section, one of the, as I said, one question that I had vis-a-vis the previous thing, whether it is a historicist move to say that the Indian historian is looking at the subaltern from a different place and therefore should not interfere, and therefore cannot endorse the violence of modernity because it's still happening in the present. And secondly, whether in the last section, in emphasizing dialogue in terms of history writing, whether we are not actually moving from history proper to something which is much more closer to anthropology, right? In terms of its premise and its idea, its goals. Whether he's not proposing an anthropological over-determination of the historical project, historiographical project. To write history as if you are an anthropologist writing history. Because the anthropologist, remember, the ethics of anthropology is to let the subject speak, right? Like classically, when anthropologists used to study primitive tribes here and there, etc., the ethics of it was that you have to, get your knowledge of them from them alone. And this became even more acute in the recent decades when the critique of anthropology, the anthropological self-reflection began to, in the 80s onwards, there was a very severe sort of backlash against anthropology's imperialist and mission, and it was felt that after that there was all this the native informant has to be an equal partner in the production of knowledge, and has to be given equal space, has to be given allowed a subjectivity, and so on. Certain new kind of ethical principles came into operation as a result of that. So it seems like there's something of that kind is happening here. So essentially you are left with this idea, what is the, supposing you were to say that this historian, see, Chakravarti is assuming that all historians belong to one privileged sector and the subaltern is in a different sector. And in fact, he says something rather in one place, which is indicative of something which we can discuss, which is that yes, on page 34, last paragraph, he says, can we imagine another moment of subaltern history, one in which we stay permanently with that which is fragmentary and episodic? So this sense of permanence is also, so in other words, he is conceiving a permanent division between the privileged historian and the subaltern, which seems somewhat, historically speaking, a problematic assumption. That question of this historian's gaze, in the case of colonialism, fascinates me. I think, but I don't know how exactly to move forward with the thinking about it. But it's any thoughts on that would be welcome.
But then can we turn around the question, maybe depart from yours, to suggest if the logic or the argument for using Weber's internal colonization works, which at least for not only for France but for several countries, I mean,
Yeah.
right?
You mean if it works?
Then we practice it.
No. Internal colonization become a universal process.
Right.
Then we should
Yeah.
critique internally.
So in that sense, internal colonization and external colonization interlinked.
Certainly.
Interlinked.
But
Yeah.
not only what my point is, it's not only we should critique, it is the process naming it as internal. So the nationalization process is a
Colonization.
process,
Mm.
right? In that
Right.
sense. But that in a way that's
No.
operates on various way. Like again, Ashish Nandi would say same thing, right? I mean, the colonization begins when colonizer left.
Mm.
This is how. So how do you?
But the
No, I think
colonizer
ethically
never
it's easy.
left.
Ethically it's easier to say. It's the same thing.
Mm.
Internal colonization, external.
Yeah.
We cannot let go.
So in that context, the critique of, as Dipesh says, the critique of imperialism goes out the window. You can't sustain it in such a context, reading.
But that's the opposite point I'm making.
Ah.
I mean, it's hold on to external imperialism and internal colonization at the same time.
Like
Okay.
criticizing
Yeah,
both.
you don't
Okay.
have to remove the notion of imperialism.
No, but then you have, when there are finished projects of nation building, such as France and America and other places, which have gone through that process, and clearly today the existing populations of those countries are not wishing to in any way undo the, what has actually been done. They're not looking to undo it. Whereas in an open field like India, where the struggle is still going on, there are many forces at work who want to either go back or go forward or stay where you are or whatever it is. Whereas in France, whatever differences they may have, they don't want to, they're not. This internal colonization is a intellectual's reading which doesn't have necessarily a conscious, is not present in the consciousness of the French citizen anymore, right? It's a kind of complete conversion. Whereas in India, the colonization process remains as a, out there as a history, the memory of oppression, memory which continues to play its role in today, and the modernization process is still challenged and questioned and, resisted and so on. So that difference is there. But the connection is very important. That is, the connection between colonialism and national, formation, nation formation. Either that you form a nation and then colonize, or you colonize and then form a nation. One way or the other, it is. It seems that they are linked together. Historically, there is a link there, which is vital. So in that sense, what you're saying is, sounds to me very crucial sort of point of revision of this our understanding.
So the question actually will lead to how do we rethink the position of the so-called subaltern people, and as your question that you put here, where he never aspired to the status of instrument of domination, or whether affirmation of that fragment is to situate them within the imagined totality and so on. So whether that's a colonized people as a subaltern class in that stratum, social stratum, or a local government where they are the bottom class, it's all colonized position, or they are the unrecognized subaltern people. How to think those people as a constitutive element in that society, and that society has to re-envisioned as a society not necessarily ruled by a certain class, but it should be participated from all members. So that's what we just have to use some mode of thought, like what Balibar would say, democratizing the border, institutional border, in all forms, and it's constantly democratizing the ideological, social, and class or gender border, and so that there's a rigid demarcation could be loosened, and the uncounted part could participate in the social domain. So that vision of the society, then it could be conceived as either a nation or whatever it is, but it's in a mobile form or dynamic form, and it would allow the subaltern to traverse this social stratum and to participate and to voice. So that requires some sort of government, some sort of institution, but that's not a so-called power center state, but it's some sort of tentative state that people can participate. So in that sense, to affirm the fragmentation, but to allow that fragment to partake and to change the constitution or composition of that state or of that society is an ongoing process. And that has to be done at the first place to be aware of the internal colonization, and also that how that was done and legitimized through historical processes.
Yeah. So there's this.
Just following up your question,
Is because then is this the position, this hands-off position? The historian must not in any way suggest anything, but simply endorse every fragmented sort of movement, right? This becomes, because there was a dramatic sort of actual incident which illustrates and produces a challenge to this very thinking, which is in Bengal, which was ruled by communists for 30 odd years, as we know. And in the course of those 30 odd years, the story is that industries just left Bengal because they couldn't deal with the communist labor problems and so on. So there was a sort of deindustrialization of Bengal which was happening and so on. So finally, in the last years of its rule, the communists decide to open up and to be more liberal, to silence the labor wing and so on, so that capital is encouraged to come back and set up industry in. So the Tatas, one of the biggest companies in India, business houses, they decided to set up a small nano car factory in just outside Calcutta, in one place called Singur. At that time, Mamata Banerjee, who was in the opposition, who is now the chief minister because she won the election, she became so popular, and this was one of the incidents that made her very popular. Her party opposed the setting up of this factory, saying that small peasants were being thrown out of their agricultural land, and this is bad for these people. It's fertile land and so on. So it became a question of industrialization or sustaining small scale agriculture. And every economist will tell you that without industrialization, this will not be enough for Bengal, for the economy, right? Economic common sense, whatever it is, whatever we may think of it, according to economists, both on the left and the right, everybody, industrialization is a dire necessity. And you cannot industrialize without securing land which is taken away from agricultural use for industrial use. And you cannot take away agricultural land without evicting somebody from there. And when you evict them, what you do is you give them some money, and peasants typically, they can't handle money. They are used to having this stable land where you can get something and somehow survive, and they are so inured, they are so used to it that if they give them money, they spend it, they are out on the streets, they are destitute, they can't look after themselves and so on. Now this is this is an illustration of just this dilemma, this kind of So what do you do? You are actually observing this process. Modernity is sort of riding roughshod over peasants' lives, disrupting their lives, uprooting their lives, and destroying possibly their futures, and so on, in the name of industrialization, which is considered something extremely necessary for West Bengal's economy not to collapse, right? So here is one of those instances where this gaze of the looking at the thing, this is repeating what happened in Europe, in the 19th century, right? This is the oppression. Now, when we were Marxists and we read all these histories of how the peasants were uprooted, we were all very angry, right? But then we were angry at a time when that story was over. But here it's happening before our eyes. But we, as intellectuals in the academy, we are told by our economist friends that this is required, otherwise the economy will collapse, people will be worse off, and so on. So it gives you a amazingly vivid illustration of this kind of problem, right? Which actually then in fact the agitation went to such an extent that that factory had to be closed down. They were building the infrastructure for the buildings and so on. They had to abandon it, and he moved his factory to some other state. And anyway, now this Mamata Banerjee, having done all that, is now trying to recover an image of somebody who is open to industry and so on. Because she realizes now, as becoming the government, that she has to bring industry into Bengal. And so where is this historian looking from at this point? And what is the historian to do? To say, I won't deal with it and I will support this. It's actually, because your knowledge is not only the knowledge of the peasant, your knowledge is the knowledge of the economy, right? So you have to say, well, take the land, but ensure that the peasants are not, abandoned. Look after them, give them something which will enable them to lead a decent life, right? You have to arrive at something like that, isn't it? There is no other option but to provide, for instance, provide jobs in the industry for the children of those peasants. You can do that. Or you can provide a bank, some kind of insurance so that they have regular income for the rest of their lives, so that they can educate their children and they can move into the modern economy, a changed, industrial economy, without too much of a, destitution and, risk of, and so on. So you have to think about some solution, isn't it? You are forced to think about a solution. You cannot say, I will ignore the industrialization thing and I will only because that also is important for the larger number of people, because it is enabling, because the world around you is changing, and if you remain deindustrialized, you are going to, more people in your country are going to suffer, and so on. So, difficult.
Sorry, I'm leaving.
You have to go to your.
Yeah,
You want to say something?
catch the
Yeah.
this earlier point. Of course, the link between external colonization and internal, and that's why there are some people, some elements in the society, appreciate external colonization because of contribution to the internal colonization, the contribution to the nation building. And exactly, but so if the two things are confounding, the external and the internal, and it will certainly have this effect, and exactly the effect is you have no, it's groundless to reject imperialism, which is exactly the purpose of confounding the two. So
right.
Okay. I think and the last point that you mentioned about the open-ended discussions of Altran, I think is this. Is that you cannot impose a theological vision of modernization or enlightenment or whatever, because if you're doing that, okay, it's easy to slip into a westernized or Eurocentric version of modernization. And so the whole thing becoming that our present state is just a kind of pre-modern state.
Right.
So the purpose the dialogue with Samaritan is to see our present situation as it is, not necessarily moving toward some kind of the end. So it's, in that sense, it's not pedagogical.
Right.
To becoming something. Rather than in this dialogical supposedly equal status, and you may have going to a different direction toward different kind of barbarian, but of course,
Deepak himself wrote very early on the history of the working class. Right?
Yes, but his was revisionist. He challenged all the prevailing shibboleths of working class history. In fact, rethinking his book is called "Rethinking Working Class History," and in fact, that's where he also comes. The worker who prays to the machinery before starting work. That kind of an example, for instance, as indicating a sensibility which is not in tune with what you might observe in a European context, that the worker and those kinds of issues. So the magic, the prevalence of magic in Indian everyday life is really and those sorts of things.
But the people on the working class is from the Soviet Union, right? I mean
the proletarian idea is it's very much. So in other words, working class history was being written in those terms, in those Soviet communistic terms, right? And in the same way, what he's saying, it's actually quite astonishing to look at it now, because it reproduced all these terms, working class, proletariat, bourgeois struggle, and so on. Whereas in reality, none of those fit the people whom you see. They don't have that consciousness, right? So they were being forcibly categorized in these terms. So national bourgeoisie, there is no, India, you cannot see any national bourgeoisie. There is a bourgeoisie in the sense that there are industrialists, there are these middle class people who are educated and who have a bourgeois mentality and all that. But it's to call it national, you need something more. It's a difference that those conditions don't prevail in India. And even the Indian working class, it's a very different working. They work in factories, but they don't have proletarian sensibility. For instance, in India, sometimes strikes are very successful. In a factory, because when a strike starts, they just go to the village. And they just live by somehow. They'll keep waiting there, and when they hear that the factory is reopened, they'll come and join again. So, because they have sustenance there. In the village you can just live anyway. It's not required. Your requirements are minimal, and you have community support groups, right? Your uncle, your neighbors, and your relatives of different kinds will look after you, you can go and find some way of living and so on. So it's constantly like that, and also this religious sort of element which is strong. So it's a very difficult to employ those categories, and Dipesh's book was actually in that way a very major critique of that kind of a historiography. But the thing that they do is to go to the other extreme and say that there is something inherently something great about this, whereas it's basically a different kind of social condition, right? Where certain magic, magic prevails, magic and other kinds of community prevails, magic prevails. So you have to describe it and say, okay, here is a particular situation. But there is a tendency to as is reflected here, to sort of treat it as something which gives India a permanently unique identity, that it can never be what it is. So in that sense, it was a very historically very useful intervention, because it really showed up the poverty of this kind of progressivist history. But having done that, it didn't sort of really genuinely produce an alternative, which is convincing. It sort of tended to celebrate that the exceptions.
When was this the 90s or?
About 9. These are all 90s essays. These are all mostly 90s essays. It was published in 2002, so they are all from the previous decade.
So get back to the historian again, this Marxist historian. So because of there's a various layered issue involved. One is obviously the political organizing fronts. The other is the transplantation of knowledge, or analytical category, what have you. Then not only the historian, but also the organizer. And because the category of untouchable did not exist analytically, how is that issue taken up with organizing? Or
those issues come up, and that is again where progressivist intellectuals will suppress the issue, because they don't want caste to come into the play. But the fact is, in reality, in any factory, in any office, in any public place, it works according to caste divisions. So they set up, you have a Communist Party trade union, and you have some other large trade unions, but underneath all that, there will be a union of one caste and another caste, caste-wise unions, associations, they will get together among themselves because they want to protect their interests against the interests of those others. So in terms of, it works because, if there are promotions due, which caste people will get promotion. If there are new vacancies, what can we do to ensure that our people get those jobs, and so on. All kinds of such things. They lobby, they work. So those are very active, industry in the Indian industrial culture, work cultures. These are there. On top, there will be these other things, and these people will also align with those when because at the larger level you need that also to fight bigger battles, but more for certain social and other kinds of reasons, and for sustenance as a community, they enter into these kinds of associations. So, and there will be exclusion of untouchable Dalit people, discriminatory practices, and all those things will be there. Now, so what does one make of it is the thing. What is so first of all, description. In terms of description, I think that is the thing. Dipesh's work describes a alternative reality which is not fitting into those models. It actually doesn't fit those models. In that sense, salutary kind of intervention against certain fantasy, derived, borrowed from Soviet, sort of sources. But beyond description, there hasn't been a sort of advance into a more independent sort of. It remains at the level of refutation of what.
What then will be your take, your position?
No, my position would be to that you have to first of all see the idea is that there are these discourses and then there is this reality. My idea would be that that there is a way to that there are these discourses, there is this reality which includes those discourses. That's the only way you can get a complete picture, and that is where the this school doesn't go. It treats it as discourse versus reality, but this reality includes these discourses and their operations. That is modernity, progress, all of these things. They are not just some outside discourse which is distorting your perception. They are part of the way. It's just that they are not effective, right? That is, they have not been able to transform society, but they remain there, hanging there as ideals. And they work, they generate new effects by virtue of being there as alternatives. And everybody is attracted to them. No, subalterns are not immune to the appeals of modernity, right? They are as much, but the thing is, there is the question of power also. it's not just a question of reality and this, what you see and what there is and this kind of thing, right? There is a question of power between the, and so on. So if you describe it and you say, look at this religion, take it seriously, you must take it seriously. That is where I agree with Dipesh Chakravarti. But having taken it seriously, you must be able to explain it and without eliminating power from the equation, right? You have to factor power into it. And in that sense, you cannot eliminate the presence, the effectivity of those discourses. Whether they distort or not is a different thing, but they are there. They are actively present and they are in different ways, drawing people out of themselves, right? Because in some way this assumes that there is a nature, there is a subaltern nature, right, which makes them subaltern, right? Like this sentence that the assumption that the statist instruments of domination will always belong to somebody else and never aspires to them. So the subaltern is somebody who will never aspire to state power. That means that there is a nature, but that's the problem, right? You can't have, but the subaltern is as much prone to wanting to be there as anybody else. It's just that their vision is limited by a certain kinds of cultural and situational sort of factors, right? So in that sense, then you're getting back to Gramsci and saying, it's the limited nature of the vision rather than a lack of aspiration that, So why ascribe lack of aspiration to the subaltern? Because that shows in some ways your own desire, isn't it?
But can we pause for the moment here, get back to Gramsci and then try to think more clearly. When subaltern study group and these historians, or when they talk about the notion of subaltern, right? I think the reference is much more clear in Indian context, right? In the sense, for instance, they cannot ignore the scheduled classes.
Right.
Right?
No, actually they did.
Huh?
In the beginning, it was not very prominent. Yeah, but you can't, you're right. Yeah, caste, yeah.
So in that sense, the notion of the specificity of the notion of the subaltern is different from the Italian context. Right?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So this is a different, I think in mind, a different imagination, and boil down to when you write the historiography. Right? The specificity, how to imagine or actually put in practice what specific form of the subaltern population are we talking about?
Right.
Not ignore that question.
Right. Well, as far as that is concerned, there is an interesting, in the history of subaltern studies, what you actually see is, initially the concentration was on tribal populations. So some people were writing about caste, but in a slightly less prominent, it was a theme that was less prominent. Because somehow, you would think that in India, caste is the subalternity is primarily manifested in caste. But the most visible one was tribes and religion. So that's an interesting thing also, because I think caste, initially they did not know how to deal with caste except in some traditional ways. But later it picked up, so there's more attention to caste in a later volume by, with new people coming in and so on.
What I mean, if you have that in mind, to read Dipesh Chakrabarty, the concluding section and so on, I think it's a different sense. It's a different sense.
Okay.
Of the so that you have that specificity in mind. These are the people really radically, ignored, elected, right, and so on. And relation with the state institution is more distant, right? And so on and so forth. Not to mention other layers of the social institutions.
See, in terms of relation to the state, these untouchables are like that. The state is constantly in their lives. Because everything, their lives depend so much on state policy, various types of programs, etc. Wherever they are, constantly they are under the, the state's gaze. They constantly, every day, they have to somehow or the other relate to the state. Either the family planning fellow, or the person who gives some special benefit, or the police who keep, watch on their activities. In innumerable ways, the state is constantly there in their lives. Right? This is the thing. So, in fact, that is why, I feel that the tribal was much more central in subaltern studies, because tribal somehow seems to be out there in the jungle, in the forest, more remote, more likely to have this nature, to have no aspirations by nature and all those things, because these people, so the Indian, the state has not, this is the problem, internal colonization, right? In fact, the complaint, if you look at what Dalits complain about, they are complaining about lack of internal colonization, not about the ravages of internal colonization. They say, you haven't made us equal citizens in so many days. You have kept us in that separate state of different from the mainstream. Right? That is the complaint in India. That's the bigger complaint.
But it's becoming equal as a status of a citizen doesn't mean to request internal colonization. Colonization means unequal powers, but becoming recognized as equally present in the public sphere doesn't mean.
No, but equal presence in the public sphere too. There has to be some minimal infrastructural preparation for that. That is, you should have education for everybody, right? Otherwise, how can you participate in the public domain on an equal footing? And it is the state's duty. I mean, that's what internal colonization means in Weber's, history of France.
National education.
National education, law. These are the ways in which, the equal applicability of the law, etc.
Still, the practice of that is, of course, a common language that everyone could.
A common language, yeah.
Allowing different languages or different language proficiencies, and also allowing challenging the narrative of the history and the challenge of the written. Given juridical practices and to modify and change the law, that means democratic participation.
Yeah.
So it, of course it's a double bind, but it doesn't really mean it will be really. I mean, it doesn't really mean that this infrastructure would necessarily be rigid domination, but it offers a participation.
No, but that's precisely what is not happening in their lives. So, no.
You can turn around and this is the teleology again, the dilemma you're facing when using Weber's case, right? And you assume the completion.
Right.
Of the internal colonization.
Sure.
The end of the internalization turns into democracy.
See, there again.
You don't need to have this. We are not thinking of democratic in terms of political system or regime, but a very radical or fundamental concept of democratic practice, participation. It doesn't need to be the party representatives. So I think that every concept is really there's a dead end if we just stop there by that given system.
See, the teleology is a fallacy, because if you plan something and you want to execute the plan, you can't call that teleology. Teleology is a conceptual mistake, where you think that there is some end towards which we are moving. But you have a constitution, right? They are not saying we want to go somewhere. They want to say the constitution has to be implemented. So it's like implementing a plan. There is nothing teleological about that. That's what I think.
It will happen, by, and also by whatever participants that will join, and then it will change. So it's always recomposed, always reconstituted. But of course, whether that allows the space for all members to participate, that's a question.
Right, yeah. It's an ongoing process. Obviously, struggles will determine how much it actually moves, but the struggles will always refer themselves to what has been set up as a common ideal, which is typically the constitution, right? So once if your struggles are in reference to that, then you are asking for a completion which is not necessarily teleological in character, but still is a very real sort of gaps which are left in because in this colonization, what the critique of the British colonialism is that it kept people in an underdeveloped state, retarded, they kept it deliberately backward and so on. Now the question is, internal colonization on the other hand seems to do the opposite. That is, it seems to unite, it seems to standardize, uniformly, homogenize and so on, right? But if you go by that standard, in India, there is no internal colonization. Rather, there is a colonization of the same kind that the British practiced, right? It's a kind of keeping separate. That's what is the discourse of the struggles now, the struggles by all these, the tribals, the untouchables, the minorities, etc. The entire discourse is about the fact that this is not happening. This so-called the constitutional guarantees have not been implemented.